This is another iRaw podcast.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the Animal Turn podcast. It gives me great pleasure to be releasing this episode. It's quite a different episode because it's an announcement actually. It's not a bonus episode or part of a season, but an announcement. I'm extremely proud to let you know that the Animal Turn podcast has been shortlisted for not one, but 2 awards in the International Women's Podcast Awards in 2023. And those award ceremonies are coming up on the 6th of November, and you can find out more by searching International Women's Podcast Awards. A little bit about the awards that the podcast has been nominated for. So we had to submit short clips from episodes that we thought there's a whole range of different categories. And the 2 that we were nominated for, that the Animal Turn was nominated for, is one, Moment of Insight from a Role Model. And that is a clip from Jeff Sebo, where we're talking about kind of biosecurity and measures to change human-animal relations and whether or not that's impossible and what kind of impossibility means. And the second award that we've been nominated for is Award for Changing the World One Moment at a Time. And that's with an interview with Yamini Narayanan, where we're talking about some of the kind of destructive tendencies of sacralisation and whether that's making a woman sacred, a child sacred, or in the case of Yamini's focus, making a cow sacred. It's a really interesting and fascinating clip. So I thought I was going to figure out a way to share this with you via social media, but I actually thought you, dear listeners, listen to me and listen to the podcast. So I'm going to share those clips with you here, and I'm going to share them with you one after the other. And just a shout out that if you are interested in attending the awards, I'll include a link in the show notes for how you can register to attend those awards and cross your fingers for the Animal Turn. So here's the first clip where I talk to Jeff Sebo about bioethics for a category called Moments of Insight from a Role Model. So coming back to bioethics then, so far as a concept, you mentioned, so what's important is autonomy, compassion, respect. And I think also there in kind of some of what you were mentioning there are questions of biotechnology. So using them as chimeras,
yeah.
Growing ears on rats or organs in pigs, that biotechnology is implicated in questions of bioethics as well. But this is kind of one stream that we were talking about with regards to health. You said that there's another stream when it comes to talking about bioethics, which is related to the environment and environmental justice. Could you maybe unpack that stream for us a little?
Yeah, and actually, I think this stream involves health too. It can be easy to think that health ethics questions are these small scale individual questions about the rights of doctors and patients and so on. But actually, public health matters a lot too, and global health matters a lot too. These broad global changes that affect health outcomes in the aggregate, and I think these questions matter much more than we might be suggesting by how many people are focusing on the individual small scale stuff. And so when it comes to animal ethics, these questions include, for example, how might our treatment of animals be contributing to global health and environmental threats like pandemics and climate change? And then conversely, how might global health and environmental threats like pandemics and climate change be impacting human and non-human populations at the same time? And I think these questions are incredibly important and also incredibly neglected, even though the world is currently going through a pandemic and has been experiencing an increase in floods and fires and heat waves and other extreme weather events that will be more frequent and intense in a world reshaped by human activity. So those are the questions that I think we really need to be paying much more attention to, in addition to continuing to pay attention to the need to treat animals better as research subjects and medical patients.
You said they're humans and non-humans. That we've tended to, so this implies to me that we've tended to, when looking at pandemics and when looking at questions of global health, focused on humans. What is it that you're hoping, or what is it that you think When you say and non-humans, what is happening in that
Mhm.
move? What does it mean to include animals in these questions?
I think it means several things. First of all, it means taking seriously how our uses of animals are contributing to these global threats. I imagine you know, and many of your listeners know, that industries that exploit and exterminate non human animals, like factory farming and deforestation and the wildlife trade, are in various ways major drivers of global health and environmental problems, like disease outbreaks and climate change related floods and fires and heat waves. When we bring into existence hundreds of billions of non-human animals and clear land for them to live and to grow plants for them to eat, and then move them from place to place, and so on and so forth, that all contributes to the development and spread of infectious diseases. And it also consumes land and water, and it produces pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, and it contributes to deforestation, which also spreads diseases and reduces biodiversity, which spreads diseases, and gets rid of trees, which capture and store carbon dioxide. So, in all of these ways, the harms that we inflict on non-human animals are wrapped up in the harms that we inflict on global health and in the environment. And so, when I emphasize the need to include non-humans, part of what I mean is really paying attention to how these industries that exploit and exterminate animals are in very large part responsible for these problems, and we need to phase down and ultimately end some of these industries, factory farming, deforestation, the wildlife trade, as part of our climate change mitigation efforts, as part of our pandemic mitigation efforts. But then the other thing that I mean, and the more neglected point, is that animals are stakeholders for our public health and environmental policies too. Animals are affected by these global health and environmental changes too. And so we really need to consider how these global changes are affecting humans and non-humans if we want to reduce harm across the board rather than only reducing
Mhm.
harm for a very small percentage of affected individuals. About that and estimating our impacts on animals at that level too, so that we can get the full picture of how our activity and how these human caused global changes are affecting them. But the problem is that we currently lack the tools that we need to do that well, because we have not invested in building up an infrastructure for answering questions about individual animal welfare at scale
Mhm.
when it comes to these global changes. And these questions are really hard. There are millions of non-human species. Each species is different. Then each individual member of each species is different. So this is an area where, on one hand, we need to improve our ability to estimate our impacts not only at the species and ecosystem level, but also at the individual health and welfare level for other animals. But on the other hand, we also need to recognize our profound limitations, that we might not ever be able to do that perfectly, and we might not even be able to do it particularly well
Yeah.
for a while, but we should still do the best we can and try to build in that direction so that we might be better able to do that in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I guess at this juncture, it would be really easy for me to say, oh, but that's just impossible. How do you think about
Hmm.
everyone? And if we can't do
Hmm.
that, if it just seems like this big impossible task, then what's the point in
Hmm.
even trying? But
Right.
I think this takes us back to the beginning of the interview when we were speaking about like the tools for thinking, that even
Hmm.
just having this conversation, thinking through bioethics as being more than a human consideration provides us some of those tools. Thinking
Yeah.
about future generations of animals, is it just, I love that you brought up biodiversity there, because I think so often in questions of conservation, it's a matter of how many numbers do we have? Are we sustaining the genetic pool? We don't
Hmm.
talk about ourselves and our different cultures and our different ways of valuing our health in those kinds of reductionist ways. And it seems kind of bizarre that we would do that for other animals too.
Hmm.
Okay, so I have a much better sense now of like global health. It's a massive catch-all phrase, but it's something that's saying we need to diversify the ways in which we think about health, not only in terms of the species lines, but also in
Hmm.
terms of geographies and kind of how changes in one part of the planet can very much impact the health and the well-being of numerous species, numerous individuals, numerous cultures in a different part of the world.
Yeah.
That's super, super helpful.
Great. Yeah. No, I think that is a great way of putting it, and I completely agree with you. And just to emphasize another point that you just made, I absolutely agree with you that it seems impossible, or at least very difficult, to improve our knowledge and our power and political will with respect to helping other animals at scale, or at least harming them less at scale, right? Because we need to learn so much more about what they need, and then we need to develop the ability to get them what they need, and we need to develop the motivation to get them what
Mm,
they need. And that might seem impossible, but just one point I would emphasize, which I think is consistent with what you were saying, is that we should not trust our intuitions about what is or is not possible right now. There are all kinds of major transformative changes that seem impossible before they happen, and then they
mm,
happen anyway, and then they seem inevitable after they happened. Really, in a lot of these cases, they are neither impossible nor inevitable, but instead are possible but kind of hard.
yeah.
And I think we should proceed on the assumption that this is like that. We might not ever be able to create a world where all animals can live in perfect harmony and nobody has to suffer or die. We might not ever be able to create that world or anything close to it, but we might be able to at least create a world where humans are treating other animals, including captive and wild animals, better at scale, because we better understand their health and welfare needs, and we are better able and more willing to meet their health and welfare needs. We can do better, probably, I
Mm.
think. and
Oh, for
and it
sure. I think
yeah
we
and
can
it
do better.
yeah, we can do better, and it seems worth trying and seeing how much better we can do, and then making an informed decision later on about where the true limits actually are, about what actually is possible and impossible.
I mean, the thing is we're all born into situations not of our choosing, times
Hmm.
not of our choosing, into
Hmm.
norms that just make things seem completely intractable. This is the way it
Yes.
is. And if it's just the way it is, how could it ever be different? And every generation of humans that have ever existed have faced norms that have said and seemed impossible. How
Hmm.
would we ever get from one continent to another? How would we
Hmm.
ever broach this illness? We're all dying. Like, and it seems that this is just the way it is, and the fates have it in for us. Yet somehow, through practice, through change, through different orientations of our ethics over time, change happens in increments until one day you're looking back and you're like, "Whoa, actually, things did change. They have changed." So I think that's really powerful. I really enjoyed speaking to Jeff. He's just got a really fantastic way of saying things quite concisely but decisively at the same time, which is wonderful. And here's the second clip, which has been nominated for an award for changing the world one moment at a time, with Yamini Narayanan. Maybe we can now start switching a little bit to talking about mother. So you said there in a moment ago that cows are kind of used as this national symbol, the symbol of motherhood, right? Like the nation mother. I remember reading about this when thinking about South Africa, how women are mobilized to be like mothers of a nation, right? The Afrikaner nationhood. But when you start to talk about an animal being the mother of a nation, it seems quite different and strange. But then again, cows are also actually mothers. And I think that this is something you do quite well, is to show how variable the idea of what a mother is in India. Like, on the one hand, you've got this national kind of rhetoric being used to mobilize and create like an idea of what India should be. But on the other hand, you've got the very material reality of what it means to be a bovine mother in India.
Yes, yes. So I was trying to unravel. You read that so perfectly, so beautifully. I was trying to unravel the different facets of being a mother, because on the surface of it, it sounds nice to say that we regard the cow as we regard our mother, right? Because the mother is one of the most treasured relationships in intrahuman relationships, right? We have the mother was probably one of the most important figureheads in intrahuman relationships. So it actually sounds like a good thing. It sounds like there can be no harm. And on the contrary, there's a profound amount of respect, love, reverence, veneration accorded to a farmed animal. It's not just, we are well past talking about humane at this point, and we're talking about venerating a being in this way. But at the same time, this idea of labeling a being as mother beyond the responsibilities and attachments that might arise between a mother and her child, whether, biological or adopted. I mean, of course, even within these realms, the use of motherhood can be very diverse. But let's to simplify here, let's just talk about the relationship between the mother and her specific child. To extend beyond that and to project a motherhood on women, for example, in some sort of a political way, is actually feminists have talked about how non-innocent and how purposively intentional and exploitative this is. So Indian feminists have said, for example, they have gone so far as to say that the labeling of women, in the case of humans, women as mothers or as wives, at least that's one label that's been spared to cows, right? But the labeling of women as mothers or wives, like the mother of, we have a cultural responsibility of being mothers of mothers of the nation, passing on cultural values of Hinduism and safeguarding the Hindu nation through our mothering responsibilities. They actually say that labeling the burden that women have had to bear as being objectified as mothers, they actually say it's one of the most significant reasons for the backward status of women in India more generally. And we are talking about the backward, we're talking about health benchmarks, education, literacy, employment, wages. In just about every realm of the Human Development Index, women in India fall amongst some of the most low ranks of enjoying any of these sorts of basic human rights, human development indexes, right? And they say that one of the reasons is this sort of labeling of women as mother, which actually ends up controlling them, cornering them, and imposing upon them a particular identity from which they cannot break out of, right?
So you're not speaking here about women who are mothers as in nursing their children. You're speaking here about how the idea of motherhood is mobilized to make women take on particular types of responsibility for passing along national identities or ideas, and that requires work and labor, but also I suppose you can't be in specific places or spaces. That if you are mothering, you're restrained in particular ways. So am I correct here? So you're not speaking necessarily about the bond between a mother and a child. You're speaking here about the kind of ideas that come with passing along something.
Absolutely, precisely. I'm actually separating the bond between a mother and child from this sort of political objectification of women as mothers, right? Because in the case of cows, and I think the case of cows exemplifies this, the political objectification of a being as mother actually completely serves to sever or violate the original bond between the mother and her child, right? So Martha Nussbaum talks about objectification, right? She talks about objectification and she outlines, I think, 7 ways in which objectification is inherently violent. She talks about objectification as a process that is inherently violent. And she notes just one exception to this, which can make it not violent, right? She says objectification is not violent when there is informed consent. If I am allowing myself to be objectified based on informed consent, then it is not necessarily violent. Then that's the one exception to objectification being violent. Animals cannot give up informed consent, right? So all forms of objectification of animals are violent. And one of the central arguments of my book is that the sacralisation of animals is also a form of objectification that is therefore inherently violent. Whether it's a sacralization as a goddess, sacralization as just inherently sacred, or one of the most harmful forms of objectification is the imposition of the motherhood mantle on a being in political frame.
I thought this was really so powerful. The idea of how being deemed sacred or godlike, we might think, I mean, so as you know, I do work on cows as well. And almost invariably, whenever I speak about cows in North America and I talk about some of the violences and objectification, people always bring up India, because India sits in a when it comes to cows, not only in Indian imaginaries but in global imaginaries, India has a very unique space, right? To people who know very little about India or Indian politics, cows are front and center, even outside of India, as being a place where somehow India is unique. And then, people will mobilize it even outside, beyond the border, saying, but, cows are sacred in India. And then you read your book and I was like, wow, well, being sacred really doesn't do the cows any favors in India, because it just seems as though if you are sacred, you have a whole bunch of things done to you, as you say, that you can't necessarily give any sort of consent for. So you paint this really incredible picture of kind of milk being poured over statues in this kind of reverence, while at the same time you've got a cow tied up with her calf that she can't get near to. Just an incredible juxtaposition of the material desire of the cow to be with her calf versus the idea of her as a sacred cow and how much that divorces her from what she might want.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The idea of sacred as being a celebratory or even a liberatory ethic is deeply, deeply unfounded. In the case of, we must remember that not too long ago, children were also worshipped in India, right? And in Hindu cultures. So child worship was common. And in fact, child worship is still common in a lot of communities or in a lot of spaces and geographies. We don't necessarily come to know about it because child worship would actually now be considered a child rights abuse. It would be considered child abuse to worship a child. But that being said, I remember not long ago, 2017, I was in Kathmandu for, again, an animal studies conference. And one of, when attached to conferences, you have a lot of, there's a lot of tourist literature. And, one of the tourist literatures that we saw was actually of a temple where a girl child was being worshipped. And we were actually horrified. We were shocked. We were so horrified. Of course, none of us went. We weren't going to participate in that. But we were actually really horrified because we had never heard of that done so openly in India. That's what I'm saying. It's not to say that it doesn't exist. It just is not so open as a lot of these things are not. But it would be considered a major child abuse, a major form of child abuse to worship a child. Because what happens when you worship a child, when you worship a woman, when you worship an animal, is that you are imposing a particular identity. Attached to that identity is a way of being, right? And that completely is at the expense of your natural way of being. If a child is being worshipped in a temple and there's going to be hundreds and thousands of pilgrims coming through every week to worship, the child loses the right to be a child, to be a child per se, and to be a specific kind of child that she might be. She might be a really, feisty child. She's not going to get to be that if she's a goddess.
Well, it's essentializing. I think all of us can relate to what that kind of essentialist move is. Anyone who's been told that there's something and they know that they're not, and you want to defend yourself, you get defensive with that. And then when being labeled as a god or sacred, when it shapes your autonomy is kind of completely removed because you have to do whatever the script is. Whatever the script is what your life becomes.
Precisely. You're reading off a script, you're living off a script, you're being controlled. That's the main thing. You're being controlled by a script. It's a way of domination. It's an act of domination to sacralize a living being.
Yeah, Yamini is one of my favorite people when it comes to cow-based research, but also urban ecologies. And anyone who's heard me speak about her book, Mother Cow, Mother India, knows that I think it's absolutely a phenomenal piece of scholarship. So I'm beyond delighted that this clip has been nominated in the International Women Podcasting Awards. All right. Thank you so much, listeners. Without you being nominated in these kinds of awards would not be possible. The Animal Turn is doing amazing things. We're nearing nearly 30,000 downloads, and season 6 is coming. Next week, we'll be launching season 6 focused on animals and politics. So make sure that you keep your ears ready.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.